5. Norfolk and Western number 2174. Now, granted, its surviving sister engines are not of the same subclass as 2174, which is a bit unusual for my list and may explain why the next engine will have one spot higher than this one. 2174 was the fourth of 30 Y6Bs built in the N&W shops in 1948. They were the railroad's final batch and refinement of its Y-Class 2882 Malays, and the most powerful steam locomotives ever built, with a tractive effort of, get ready for this, 177,000 pounds. In addition, their power output, which although is not as important as tractive effort, could equal that of the Union Pacific big boys, making these Malays the perfect rival for the world's largest steam locomotives. As some of us know, shortly before the Norfolk and Western gave up steam locomotives, the 2174 was used on a farewell to steam excursion on July the 11th of 1959. Afterward, it was sold to a scrapyard in Roanoke, along with Y6A number 2143. The local chapter of the National Railway Historical Society tried to save the 2174, but in 1976 the yard's ownership was transferred to an impatient owner who had no interest in preserving the Malays in his yard. In the aftermath, later that year, the 2143 and 2174, the last of the Y6Bs, were both tragically scrapped. But as we all know, two other Y-Class Malays are still around, those being Y3A number 2050 from the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and Y6A number 2156, which recently returned to the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri, where Frisco 1522, Big Boy 4006, and many more locomotives are also displayed at. Number 4. Union Pacific Big Boys number 4003, 4019, and 4022. This Big Boy trio got one spot above 2174 because they are brother engines of both the 7 surviving 1941 built Big Boys and the sole surviving 1944 built one. These particular Big Boys were among 4 Big Boys to stand out from the rest in the days of steam, the fourth being 4005. Starting with 4003, it is most well known for being caught on film more often than any other Big Boy, despite having not logged the most miles. By the way, the title of the most logged miles goes to 4006, mentioned earlier. That's not counting the extra miles 4014 has logged ever since being restored. In fact, 4006 is the only Big Boy I've seen in person so far. Anyway. Next up is the final Big Boy of the 1941 batch, number 4019. From 1944 to 1945, it was fitted with elephant-eared smoke deflectors and was the only Big Boy to be so. Smoke deflectors, as the name implies, are meant to deflect smoke, specifically to help lift it above the locomotive so that it doesn't drift around and block the engineer's view. But the nozzles and blowers in the Big Boy's smoke boxes were more than capable of lifting the smoke above the locomotive on their own, which thus made the smoke deflectors useless, and they were eventually removed in 1945. The final is number 4022, which represented the UP at the Chicago Rail Fair of 1949. For this, 4022's smoke box was painted black instead of the usual gray, and the engine also got a stage mate on its pilot during the event. After the UP had completely dieselized by 1962, 8 Big Boys, including 4005, escaped the cutter's torch, while the remaining 17, that's including 4003, 4019, and 4022, were scrapped, making 4005 the only surviving Big Boy that did stand out in the days of steam. Yes, 4014 now stands out for having been returned to operational condition, but that Big Boy did not stand out in the days of steam. In case you're wondering about 4005, it was the only Big Boy to burn oil in the steam age, and also the only one to be involved in an accident. The other remaining Big Boys are 4004, 4006, 4012, 4014, 4017, 4018, and 4023. If this list was exclusively for American locomotives, this Big Boy trio would have been number 1 on it. But I decided to make this list for classes all over the world because I ran out of ideas for my scrapped, separate British list. Number 3.
Deutsche Reichsbahn 05 Hudson number 002. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, or DRG for short, was Germany's nationalized railway system created after World War I from the regional railways of the individual states of the German Empire. Hopefully my German pronunciation was at least decent for this bit, but in case not, I'm just gonna continue this segment using the initials DRG instead of Deutsche Reichsbahn just to not create so many bloopers over it. I know I should still improve. Ever since the success of high-speed dieselized trains like the Flying Hamburger in the mid-1930s, the DRG decided to turn to steam locomotives because apparently they'd found them faster. Following some speed tests with a streamlined 03 class Pacific, Borsig Locomotive Works, to put it into English translation, built 3 larger Hudsons designated as the Class 05 from 1935 to 1937. Albeit more so for politics as Nazi propaganda though. Yeah, I know, that's nasty AF. The 05s were numbers 001 through 003, with the 05 placed in front of their road numbers to identify them as 05s. The first engines, 001 and 002, were built in 1935 with this very odd-looking streamlining, while the third engine, 003, was built in 1937 as a cab forward and also with the odd streamlining. These were some of the most unusual-looking locomotives ever built, and to add on for it, they also had massive 90-inch diameter driving wheels. Now onto the subject engine and star of the entire class, number 002. On the 11th of May 1936, during a run on the Berlin-Hamburg line with a 217-ton freight train, the 002 reached a maximum speed of 124.5 miles per hour, or 200.4 kilometers per hour, becoming the new fastest steam locomotive in the world. But sadly for the Germans, their record was broken 2 years later by Mallard, which, although was going slightly downhill, was pulling a much heavier 268.8 ton train. Say what you want about the Mallard, but her record still stands today. After Germany lost the Second World War, the 05s were taken to the engine shop in Hamm, Westphalia? How do you pronounce that? Help? Because there were only 3 of these locomotives, their region of the now split DRG, the Deutsche Bundesbahn, or Western Region of DRG, or DB for short, had intentions of scrapping all of them. But then the 05s were sent to Krasmafia? Gosh, how do you pronounce that name? See, this is why I only put 1 German locomotive on the list. Pronunciation problems. To be restored to operation, with 003 re-entering service in 1950, and the other 2 following in 1951, albeit with all 3 having their boiler pressure reduced from 290 psi to 230 psi, or from 20 bar to 16 bar. The 05s spent the remainder of their careers hauling the Hanseat and Darmstadt's long-distance express trains on the 437-mile-long Hamburg-Cologne-Frankfurt line at regular speeds of 87 miles per hour, or 140 kilometers per hour, until being withdrawn in favor of diesel locomotives in 1958. Although the first engine, 001, was spared, the remaining, including the record-breaking 002, were not so lucky and scrapped. Today, the 05001 is on display at the Nuremberg Transport Museum in Nuremberg, Germany. But it's an awful shame that the 002 wasn't spared from scrap, since it was the one that broke the world speed record for steam locomotives, not the 001. It would be nice if we had the real 05002 still around for the sake of the record, even if it only lasted 2 years. Number 2. London and Northeastern A4 Pacific number 2509, Silver Link. Built in 1935 and painted silver for the LNER's Silver Jubilee passenger train, Silver Link was the first of 35 total Gresley A4 Pacifics built from 1935 to 1938. Yes, they were designed by the legend himself, Sir Nigel Gresley. They were essentially tweaked and streamlined versions of his previous A1 and A3 Pacifics. While most of the A4s were painted in the iconic LNER garter blue livery with red wheels, and a few more in LNER apple green like Grizzly's A1s and A3s, Silverlink was among 4 A4 Pacifics to be painted silver for the Silver Jubilee trains. During Silverlink's first run, it was recorded at a maximum speed of 112 miles per hour, breaking every previous speed record beforehand. Although the record was soon broken by LMS 6220, Coronation in 1937, Mallard, as we all know, then avenged Silverlink in the ultimate way by reaching 126 miles per hour in 1938, and permanently becoming the new fastest steam locomotive in the world, just like I said in the previous segment, much to the relief of the LNER and pity of the LMS. Silverlink continued its career with the LNER as 2509, hauling passenger trains including the Silver Jubilee, and even into the days of British Railways as 60014, until being decommissioned on December the 29th of 1962. Despite the efforts of Sir Billy Butland to save it from scrap, they ended up failing, and in 1963, the Silverlink was scrapped. All that remains of the Silverlink are 2 of its nameplates at the National Railway Museum in York. Fortunately, 6 A4s are still around today, and one of them, 4464, Bittern, has even masqueraded as number 4492, Dominion of New Zealand, and Silverlink in the past. It also would have been nice if an apple green A4 also survived, since none of them did. With one more locomotive remaining, how about a few honorable mentions? Some personal to everyone, and some to me. Number 1. London and Northeastern A1 number 4470, Great Northern, and A3 number 2750, Papyrus. Flying Scotsman, as most of us already know, is the undisputed most famous steam locomotive in the world, and has been defending that title since the near start of its life. And being the sole survivor of its class, it's not a surprise that she is the most famous member. But what is less known is that Scotsman didn't take all of the class's fame for itself, but instead did have a few sister engines to share the class's fame with. These 2 fallen sister engines of him are what interest me the most. Starting with LNER 4470, or GNR 1470, named Great Northern, she was the first of 52 Grizzly A1s built at Doncaster Works in 1922. But not all were built by the LNER. The first 12, including Great Northern and Scotsman, were built by the Great Northern Railway and numbered 1470 through 1481, but renumbered to 4470 through 4481 after the Great Northern became part of the LNER under the 1923 Grouping Act. Meanwhile, the rest of the A1s, which weren't finished by the time of the Grouping Act, were numbered 2543 through 2582, instead of continuing the 4470 sequence for some reason. Why? Anyway, and if you were paying attention, you would have also figured out by now that Scotsman was originally GNR 1472 before becoming LNER 4472. That was because it was the third Grizzly A1. I can't talk. The A1s were the last Grizzly designs for the GNR, and also Grizzly's first Pacifics, so that meant that 1470 was Grizzly's first Pacific, with Scotsman being his third. So we're already seeing some historical significance from this A1. From 1928 to 1935, the LNER built a total of 27 A3s. The 8th locomotive was number 2750, named Papyrus and built at Doncaster Works in March of 1929. The A3s were upgraded versions of the A1s, and Papyrus proved it well when on March the 5th of 1935, while pulling 217 tons of freight, she reached a max speed of 108 miles per hour, 8 more than the 100 mile per hour speed record Scotsman made for the A1s. To this day, Papyrus holds the fame for the fastest speed record ever set by a member of its class, and the fastest speed ever reached by a non-streamlined British locomotive. It also earned worldwide fame and was for a brief time the fastest steam locomotive in the world. But despite their historical significance, only one of these two Pacifics would make it into BR days as a Grizzly Pacific. So what happened? Starting from 1928, the LNER began upgrading the A1s to A3s, but this process took a long time and wasn't finished until 1949, so literally a year after BR was formed. But of the 52 A1s, all but 4470 were rebuilt as A3s, so now you're wondering, what happened to Great Northern? After Sir Nigel Gresley passed away in office in 1941, Edward Thompson succeeded him as Chief Mechanical Engineer of the LNER. During World War II, Thompson advised a new standardization program involving 10 locomotive designs, including 2 Pacific classes of his design, but the damages of the war prevented him from proceeding with his plan. So, Thompson made the infamous decision to rebuild a few of his ideas from existing Gresley locomotives. Not really a good idea because he had to save on construction costs and even on the designing thanks to the war. And those ideas included turning a batch of Gresley's V2s into his problematic A2/1s, and all 6 of Gresley's E2 Mikados into his infamously crappy A2/2s. In fact, it was starting with the A2/2s his infamy began.
In 1944, before building any new fresh locomotives, Thompson decided to rebuild a Grizzly A1 into a Pacific of his own design just to see how the design would work. But instead of selecting a particular A1 that was known for nothing, Thompson only worsened his infamy more by selecting Great Northern, Grizzly's first Pacific and the first of the A1s.
No! No! Does not compute! Does not compute! It does not compute! I think so!
And trust me, this only had negative reactions from the high-up LNER officials. They tried their best to talk Edward out of rebuilding Great Northern into this Pacific, and instead do it to a different A1, minus Scotsman, but he had none of it.
Thompson essentially let his personal feelings toward Gresley cloud his judgment, and in 1945, he rebuilt 4470 into the hideous A1/1.
This is stupid! This is stupid! 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 Stupid!
Considering how controversial this idea was, his ill temper, and what he had done to the P2s, one of Gresley's greatest locomotives, Thompson did not have a good heart toward one of the greatest locomotive designers of all time. This is Sir Nigel Gresley we're talking about. Why is he one of the greatest locomotive designers of all time? Because he was the very man that designed the A4 Pacifics. And because one of them, number 4468, Mallard, became the fastest steam locomotive in the world and has been holding that title for more than 80 years at this point, which is why Gresley is so great. To do this kind of thing to one of the greatest locomotive designers of all time, this is an absolute sin.
Like the A2/2s, the A1 shared the same hideous appearance and was problematic, though not as much as the A2/2s, but easily crappier than even the Gresley A1s.
From this point on, the rebuilt 4470, which later became 113 under Thompson's renumbering scheme, and then 60113 by BR, suffered a rough and tragic life of infamy, all because of Thompson's foolish actions.
Meanwhile, Papyrus enjoyed the rest of her career in the same form, eventually becoming 96 under that renumbering scheme in 1946, and then 60096 by BR after it was formed in 1948. The A1/1 was finally retired in 1962, with Papyrus following in 1963. Ironically, despite the fact that Great Northern was now a hideous and crappy Pacific, there was actually an attempt to save it from scrap. Presumably to, of course, undo what Thompson did to it and rebuild it back into its Grizzly A1 form, and revert it to either LNER 4470 or GNR 1470. But that attempt was unsuccessful, and Grizzly's first Pacific, Great Northern, bit the dust at the hands of the Cutter's torch. And for Papyrus, despite the significance of its 108-mile-per-hour record, she ended up becoming among 77 A3s to be scrapped, leaving only one A3, Flying Scotsman, behind. This duo of sister engines to Scotsman could have made an iconic trio of non-streamlined and apple green Grizzly Pacifics if they too had been saved like Scotsman. Their historical significances and the fame they allowed Scotsman to share with his class and not to himself, and that it's out of the question that they will ever get the new build treatment, land these fallen Grizzly Pacifics the #1 spot on my list of non-surviving locomotives from preserved classes.